There comes a moment in life when language can no longer reach what is happening inside the soul. You try to explain, you try to justify yourself, you try to defend your intentions, yet every sentence feels insufficient, shallow, incapable of carrying the weight of what you are experiencing. Words fall short, not because you lack intelligence, but because the soul has entered a depth that speech cannot map. It is precisely at this point that silence begins to emerge, not as emptiness, but as resistance, not as withdrawal, but as strength. Silence, in its truest form, is not the absence of sound, it is the presence of mastery. It is one of the oldest and most powerful forces known to the spiritual realm, and no one understood this force more deeply than Jesus. When we observe the life of Christ carefully, there is a detail that most people overlook. Jesus spoke very little. His words were concise, deliberate, and restrained. He never wasted speech. While others attempted to dominate rooms through arguments and rhetoric, Jesus transformed environments through presence alone. His calm unsettled rulers. His restraint destabilized authorities. His silence carried more weight than entire speeches delivered by those who sought control. Jesus possessed a serenity that disarmed even the most powerful figures of his time. When the Pharisees tried to provoke him, he did not debate. When he was falsely accused, he did not rush to explain himself. When he was mocked, humiliated, and betrayed, he did not retaliate. And yet nothing and no one managed to remove him from the center of his peace. Imagine possessing that kind of internal authority, standing in the middle of chaos and remaining whole, being surrounded by misunderstanding, judgment, and betrayal, and still staying grounded, aware, and composed. This is the power contained in the silence of Jesus. It is a form of power the world does not recognize, but heaven immediately honors. The world equates strength with noise. The kingdom equates power with dominion. Dominion over the self, dominion over emotions, dominion over speech. This was not something Jesus merely taught verbally. He embodied it in every response he withheld. He understood that whoever governs their silence governs the atmosphere, and whoever governs the atmosphere has already won the invisible war. The prophet Isaiah captured this mystery centuries before Christ walked the earth. Like a lamb led to the slaughter, and like a sheep silent before its shearers, he did not open his mouth. Isaiah 53, verse 7. This prophetic image describes a Jesus who refuses to react even when pushed beyond human limits. He knew the difference between reaction and response. Reaction is submission to external control. Response is alignment with the Spirit. Jesus never allowed circumstances to command him. He responded not to what he saw, but to what he knew. That is why he could stand before Pilate in silence, why he could endure mockery without returning insult, why he could bleed and still look at humanity with compassion. His silence was not empty, it was saturated with awareness. His silence was the voice of someone who had already won internally before ever prevailing externally. And this is where the message begins to reach you. Because perhaps what God is teaching you in this season is not how to argue more effectively, but how to become silent with intention. Not how to convince others, but how to stop needing validation. Not how to defend your name, but how to rest in the certainty that time reveals what speech cannot protect. Jesus did not lose battles by remaining silent. He won every one of them. Because silence carries sound in the kingdom. There is wisdom hidden in restraint. Silence interrupts destructive cycles. When someone attacks you and you respond in anger, the cycle continues. But when you choose silence, the end comes within you. And that is the real sacrifice. To kill within yourself the impulse to return what you were given. To resist the reflex to retaliate. This is where you begin to resemble Jesus, not on public platforms of faith, but in the unseen corridors of the soul. When pain arrives, the mind screams for reaction. Explain yourself, defend your position, do something. But the Spirit whispers something radically different. Wait, be still, trust. That whisper is the highest form of education, because the silence of God is not abandonment, it is the classroom where faith matures. God does not go silent to punish you, He goes silent to shape you. And in the space between what you feel and what God has not yet spoken, trust is born. Jesus lived entirely within this spiritual atmosphere. When storms rose, He slept. When betrayal came, He forgave. When the cross approached, He surrendered. And the world assumed He had failed. But in the silence of the cross, heaven declared victory. Because silence is not absence, it is presence operating on a different frequency. It is when you do not speak, yet heaven listens. When you stop moving, yet the Spirit works. When you release control, and God begins to act. And perhaps that is exactly what is happening in your life right now. You feel wordless, exhausted, as if what is happening inside you no longer fits into language. But God is using this season to realign you with His rhythm. You are being trained to win internal battles the world will never notice. Externally, it looks like stagnation. Internally, it's precision work. Ecclesiastes tells us there is a time to be silent and a time to speak. Jesus mastered both. And because He understood when to remain silent, His words carried unmatched authority when He finally spoke. The power of speech is born from the discipline of silence. This is a spiritual principle the modern world has forgotten. We live in an era of noise. Everyone speaks. Few listen. Everyone has opinions. Very few have discernment. And as a result, words have lost their weight. But the words of someone who has learned restraint weigh tons. Jesus spoke little because He listened deeply. He listened to the Father. He listened to the Spirit. He listened to timing. That is why every word He released landed with precision. Silence is the tuning of the soul to heaven. It refines the heart, clears the mind, and reveals what truly matters. Those who learn to remain silent do not lose their voice, they gain authority. Those who learn to wait do not lose time, they gain direction. Those who trust God's timing do not lose strength, they gain purpose. Have you noticed that the wisest people speak less? Because those who understand silence understand God. The Spirit's voice does not arrive through shouting, it comes as a whisper, just as it did with Elijah. Not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but in a gentle stillness. Divine power has always chosen the subtle path. Miracles begin where no one is looking. Transformation starts where there is no applause. That is why Jesus repeatedly withdrew to pray alone. It was not escape, it was restoration. He knew that anyone who speaks with heaven does not need to justify themselves to earth. His silence was not empty, it was inhabited. And if you want to learn how He overcame, you must relearn how to be silent, not out of fear, but out of mastery. Because the one who understands the power of silence is no longer enslaved to confusion. There are seasons when silence feels unbearable, not because nothing is happening, but because too much is happening beneath the surface. The noise stops, the voices fade, the distractions fall away, and what remains is you, alone with God, alone with your thoughts, alone with what has been avoided for too long. This is the moment most people try to escape, but this is the moment where transformation begins. Human instinct equates movement with progress. If nothing appears to be changing, the mind assumes stagnation. Yet the kingdom of God operates on a different logic. In the kingdom, silence is movement, stillness is construction. The invisible is where the most decisive victories are won. Jesus understood this reality deeply. That is why He never rushed to react. He never hurried to prove Himself. He never allowed pressure to dictate His pace. His authority did not come from visibility, it came from alignment. Consider the scene in Matthew 26 when Jesus is brought before the religious leaders and falsely accused. Voices rise, accusations multiply, lies are stacked upon lies. The atmosphere is charged with manipulation and hostility, and Scripture records a striking detail. But Jesus remained silent. No rebuttal, no defense, no clarification. From the outside, it looks like defeat. From the inside, it is the highest form of dominion. Because silence, when chosen consciously, becomes territory. It is ground you refuse to surrender to chaos. It is the boundary where the enemy loses leverage. The truth does not require protection when it is anchored in God. It sustains itself. There are moments when God invites you into the same territory. You want to explain, you want to confront, you want to correct misunderstandings, and the Spirit gently restrains you. Not because your words are wrong, but because silence will do more than speech ever could. This is where most people misunderstand God. They interpret restraint as injustice. They assume silence equals loss. But silence, when led by the Spirit, is never passive. It is strategic. Jesus knew when to speak and when not to. In the desert, when the enemy challenged his identity, "If you are the Son of God," Jesus responded with Scripture, not emotion, not defensiveness, not urgency. His response was measured, grounded, and precise. Why? Because the real power was not in proving who he was, but in remaining who he was without needing proof. That is the essence of spiritual maturity. True power does not need to announce itself. Silence becomes the shield of faith. When you learn to remain silent, you protect your purpose. Not every promise survives explanation. Not every seed can endure exposure. Some processes collapse when spoken too early. That is why God often silences you, not to suppress you, but to shield what is growing. Many people lose what God is forming because they speak too soon. They explain what is still being shaped. They justify what is still fragile. They expose what was meant to mature in hiddenness. God's silence is not punishment, it is preservation. The Spirit works most effectively in environments of quiet trust. Noise fragments focus. Silence concentrates power. Psalm 37 says, "Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for Him." This is not poetic advice, it is a spiritual blueprint. Stillness is not surrender to inactivity. Waiting is not stagnation. It is internal alignment with divine timing. While the world operates through urgency, the kingdom moves through peace. Peace is not weakness. Peace is stability under pressure. Silence is where the foundations of the soul are reinforced. It is in stillness that the Spirit reorganizes what noise has disordered. In quietness, He reveals what must be healed, what must be forgiven, what must be released. And that is where real power begins. Jesus often withdrew to solitary places to pray. Luke 5:16 records this rhythm. He was not escaping responsibility, he was refueling authority. He understood that strength flows from silence, not from constant engagement. Those moments away from the crowd were where direction was clarified, where the invisible became instruction, where communion replaced explanation. Jesus did not need the approval of people because He lived from the affirmation of the Father. And anyone who has heaven as a witness does not need an audience on earth. Silence is reconciliation territory. It is where you stop arguing with your past and begin listening to your present, where explanation gives way to purpose, where reaction is replaced by discernment. God leads you into silence when He wants to teach you how to live from the center rather than the surface. Those who live from the surface are reactive, easily triggered, constantly defending, always explaining. But those who live from the center are guided, anchored, governed by the Spirit. This is what Jesus came to restore, the lost center of the human soul. He did not only come to forgive sin, He came to reintroduce alignment, to teach humanity how to live attuned to God again. That attunement is never noisy. It grows in rest, it deepens in serenity, it matures in silence. Think of the times you wanted to act and God restrained you. The moments you wanted to speak and felt blocked. It felt unfair, uncomfortable, but often that restraint was protection. The Father holding your words so they would not be scattered by the wind. Some things only grow when the soul learns to remain quiet, because the Spirit only speaks clearly when competing voices fall silent. Silence is the environment of revelation. It is not emptiness, it is fullness. It is not absence, it is direction. It is not weakness, it is mastery. Jesus' disciples often marveled at how he responded to pressure. They watched him endure hostility without agitation. They saw him dismantle pride without confrontation. Sometimes all he needed was a look, a still gaze that dissolved ego and exposed intention. His silence did not intimidate, it transformed, because it reflected complete alignment with the Father. And that is the kind of silence the Spirit desires to cultivate in you. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of awareness. Not silence rooted in fear, but silence born of confidence. Not silence of apathy, but silence of presence. There is a profound difference between being silent because you have given up and being silent because you trust. One is resignation, the other is faith. Jesus' silence always came from faith. That is why even when everything appeared lost, he was winning. Faith does not shout, faith knows. And when you begin to trust that inner knowing, this quiet certainty that does not need validation, something shifts. Anxiety loosens its grip, urgency fades, the mind settles. And suddenly you experience what Jesus carried, peace independent of circumstances. This peace is the most underestimated spiritual weapon. It cannot be manufactured, it cannot be stolen by chaos, it cannot be shaken by misunderstanding. It is the peace Jesus spoke of, the kind the world cannot give and cannot take away. This is the authority of inner dominion, victory that manifests first in the heart before it ever appears in outcomes. If you want to overcome, learn restraint. If you want guidance, learn to listen. If you want authority, learn to wait. Everything authentic unfolds in God's time, and God's timing is never loud. While the world rushes, heaven works quietly. While opinions multiply, the Spirit whispers essentials. Those who learn to hear that whisper rediscover one of the most forgotten powers of faith, the power of not needing control and still remaining centered. And this is precisely what Jesus invites you into. Not striving, not defending, not forcing outcomes, but resting in trust. Because the sky is already defending what you no longer need to explain. You may be standing in a season where nothing seems to be happening. Heaven feels quiet. Your prayers feel heavy. Words feel useless. Signs feel absent. But what if this silence is not absence at all? What if it is presence, God teaching you the language of eternity? Jesus experienced this in Gethsemane, alone, the disciples asleep, his sweat falling like drops of blood, and the Father silent. No voice, no intervention, no escape, only quiet. And in that quiet, Jesus made the most powerful decision in history. Not my will, but yours be done. That silence was not defeat, it was surrender. And surrender is not weakness, it is the release of control that allows God to do the impossible. Heaven moves when you stop grasping. Silence is the purest expression of trust. It is a cry only the Spirit understands. When you stop trying to prove, God begins to reveal. When you let go of external battles, heaven enters the internal war. And when you finally fall silent, the spiritual realm listens. Exodus 14:14 declares, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Moses spoke these words while the sea was still closed, the threat still present, fear still real. And perhaps you are standing in that same place, the obstacle ahead, the pressure behind, uncertainty within. But just as Jesus and Moses understood, there are moments when silence is the weapon that opens impossible paths, because creation itself was born from silence. Before light spoke, there was stillness. Silence is the womb of the word, and that is why the enemy fears it, because silence is where God repositions you. So do not fight the quiet, learn to inhabit it. God is not inactive, He is preparing you. And when the moment arrives, silence will not break into noise, but into revelation. You will understand why restraint was necessary. You will see what your silence sustained. You will realize that while you saw nothing, heaven was building everything. And those who doubted your quietness will witness the strength of your testimony. Silence is not the end. There is a profound paradox in the spiritual life. The moments that feel most empty are often the moments God is working most intensely. Silence has a way of exposing what noise keeps hidden. It strips away distractions, removes external validation, and leaves the soul face to face with truth. This is why silence feels uncomfortable. It does not numb, it reveals. Most people are not afraid of suffering, they are afraid of stillness. Pain at least gives the illusion of movement. Silence removes that illusion and forces you to confront what cannot be outrun. Yet this confrontation is precisely where healing begins.
Jesus never resisted quiet seasons. He leaned into them. He trusted what the Father was doing beneath the surface. And because he trusted, he did not panic when heaven seemed quiet. He understood that God's silence is not indifference, it is intention. When God is forming something durable, he works slowly. Loud transformations collapse easily. Quiet ones endure. This is why Jesus warned against public displays of spirituality disconnected from internal depth. He taught that prayer in secret carries greater authority than prayer performed for visibility. He instructed his followers to fast without announcement, to give without spectacle, to seek God where no one else was watching. The kingdom does not reward noise, it rewards alignment. Silence is the environment where alignment deepens. It is in quiet seasons that God corrects distortions in identity. When applause fades and affirmation disappears, what remains is who you truly are. This is uncomfortable but necessary, because anything built on external validation will eventually collapse under pressure. Jesus never built his identity on human approval. Even when crowds followed him, he withdrew. Even when his popularity surged, he reduced visibility. He did not confuse attention with authority. He understood that influence without depth becomes dangerous. In silence, God dismantles false attachments. He separates calling from ego. He removes dependence on reaction. He recenters the soul. This internal work is invisible, but its effects are permanent. Many people mistake quiet seasons for regression. They assume they are going backward because they no longer feel productive. But the Spirit measures growth differently. Productivity builds outcomes, formation builds capacity. God is not just preparing what you will do, He is preparing what you will carry. Jesus was not rushed into public ministry. 30 years of obscurity preceded 3 years of impact. Silence shaped him long before visibility revealed him, and that ratio has never changed in the kingdom. Depth always precedes manifestation. When God hides you, He is not neglecting you, He is increasing your structural integrity. A soul that has not been strengthened in silence cannot sustain authority in exposure. This is why many people collapse under success. They were promoted before they were formed. Silence forms endurance. It teaches you how to stand without reassurance, how to remain faithful without feedback, how to trust without confirmation. These are not optional lessons, they are prerequisites for stewardship. Jesus demonstrated this when he faced betrayal. Judas's act did not provoke reaction. Peter's denial did not trigger anger. Jesus did not panic because his identity was not anchored in loyalty from others. It was anchored in communion with the Father. When identity is secure, silence becomes natural. You do not need to argue when you know who you are. You do not need to explain when your life carries evidence. You do not need to react when truth will eventually surface. Silence is not weakness, it is certainty without noise. There is a refining fire that burns quietly. It removes impurities without spectacle. This is how God purifies motives. He brings you into seasons where outcomes are delayed and responses are absent, so that what remains is genuine faith. Faith that depends on reward is not faith, it is transaction. Faith that persists without reinforcement is devotion. Jesus embodied this devotion fully. Even when his prayers were unanswered, he remained obedient. Even when the Father did not intervene, he trusted the plan. This is where many struggle. They interpret unanswered prayer as rejection, but often it is preparation. The absence of response does not mean the absence of activity. Silence is often the sound of God doing deep work. Jesus knew this in Gethsemane. Heaven was quiet. His anguish was real, yet obedience did not waver. He was not sustained by comfort, he was sustained by conviction. This is what silence produces, conviction that does not depend on circumstances. There are seasons where God removes emotional reinforcement so that faith can mature beyond feelings. Emotional dependence can become spiritual immaturity if left unchecked. Silence teaches you to walk by trust rather than sensation. This is not abandonment, it is advancement. Just as muscles grow under resistance, the soul strengthens under quiet pressure. Silence resists the ego's demand for immediacy. It resists the mind's obsession with control. It trains patience, humility, and endurance. Jesus learned obedience through suffering, not because he lacked obedience, but because obedience had to be embodied under pressure. Silence was part of that embodiment. God is less interested in how loudly you can declare faith than in how steadily you can live it. Silence exposes what is rooted and what is superficial. Many people can speak well about God. Fewer can remain faithful when God is quiet. Quiet seasons test allegiance. Do you trust God for who he is or only for what he provides? Jesus trusted the Father even when provision was delayed, even when deliverance did not come immediately. He understood that delay is not denial, it is design. Design requires precision. Precision requires patience. Patience is born in silence. There is a reason Scripture repeatedly links strength to stillness. In quietness and trust is your strength. Strength that depends on constant reassurance is fragile. Strength forged in silence is resilient. This resilience is what allowed Jesus to carry the weight of the cross without collapsing under despair. His inner world was anchored. His outer suffering could not destabilize him. This is the kind of anchoring God is building in you. It may feel like nothing is happening, but beneath the surface, the Spirit is restructuring your foundation. Old patterns are being dismantled. Emotional dependencies are being corrected. False narratives are being exposed. Silence removes crutches. And while that removal feels painful, it is necessary for long-term strength. God is not trying to make you comfortable. He is making you capable. Capable of standing without applause. Capable of loving without reciprocation. Capable of obeying without understanding. These capacities are not developed in noise. They are forged in quiet obedience. Jesus did not resist obscurity. He embraced it as preparation. He did not demand explanation. He trusted purpose. When the time came to speak, his words carried authority because they were born from silence. Authority cannot be manufactured. It emerges from consistency in hidden places. Silence is where your internal alignment is tested and strengthened. It reveals whether your faith is circumstantial or foundational. And this is why quiet seasons often precede expansion. God does not enlarge capacity without reinforcing structure. If he is keeping you silent, he is strengthening you. If he is delaying visibility, he is increasing depth. If he is withholding answers, he is refining trust. Silence is not the enemy of progress. It is the incubator of transformation. Jesus understood this. That is why he never rushed divine timing. He moved when the Father signaled, not when pressure mounted. Pressure demands reaction. Alignment produces response. Silence teaches you the difference. And once you learn it, you stop being controlled by urgency. You stop being manipulated by opinion. You stop being shaken by delay. You begin to live from conviction rather than reaction. That is freedom. And freedom is one of the clearest signs of spiritual maturity. You are not being ignored, you are being formed. The quiet is not empty, it is full of instruction. And when this season completes its work, you will emerge with clarity, stability, and authority that cannot be shaken by noise, because what is built in silence cannot be destroyed by chaos. There is a point in the journey where silence stops feeling like restraint and begins to feel like refuge. What once felt heavy becomes protective. What once felt confusing becomes clarifying. This shift does not happen suddenly. It is the result of internal alignment slowly settling into place. At first, silence feels like loss. You lose your voice, your influence, your sense of momentum. But over time, you begin to notice something subtle yet profound. Your peace increases as your need to explain decreases. The urgency to react weakens. The compulsion to control outcomes loosens its grip. And in that release, strength begins to surface. Jesus did not treat silence as an enemy. He treated it as a discipline. He knew that power ungoverned by restraint becomes destructive. That is why he never rushed to answer every accusation or satisfy every demand. He did not confuse access with obligation. Not every question deserves an answer. Not every challenge requires engagement. Not every misunderstanding needs correction. Discernment is knowing the difference. Jesus exercised this discernment constantly. When crowds demanded signs, he often withdrew. When leaders tried to trap him with words, he responded minimally or not at all. His restraint frustrated those who sought control because they could not manipulate him through reaction. Silence is immune to manipulation. When you stop reacting, you remove leverage from those who seek to provoke you. Reaction gives power away. Silence reclaims it. This is not passive behavior, it is active governance of the inner world. Silence becomes strength when it is chosen consciously, not imposed externally. When you stop speaking out of impulse and begin responding from conviction, you move from survival to sovereignty. Jesus lived from this place. He was not silent because he lacked words. He was silent because he understood timing. He knew that truth released prematurely can be distorted. He understood that revelation requires readiness, not only in the speaker, but in the listener. This is why many of his teachings were delivered in parables. He concealed truth not to confuse, but to protect it. Truth that is forced on unreceptive hearts becomes weaponized. Silence guards wisdom. In your own life, silence will begin to function the same way. You will notice that fewer explanations are necessary. You will feel less pressure to convince. The need for validation will diminish. This is not emotional numbness, it is emotional regulation. When silence matures into strength, your identity stabilizes. You are no longer defined by reaction or recognition. You become anchored in being rather than performing. Jesus demonstrated this anchoring throughout his ministry. Even at moments of intense confrontation, his internal state remained stable. His responses were measured, his actions deliberate.
He was not controlled by external stimuli. This kind of stability is rare because it requires surrendering the illusion of control. It requires trusting God's sovereignty more than your own urgency. Silence teaches you that outcomes are not sustained by constant input. Some outcomes require withdrawal. Some battles are won by disengagement. This is why Scripture often associates stillness with victory. The instinct to fight every battle drains discernment. Silence conserves energy for what truly matters. Jesus did not address every injustice immediately. He allowed certain wrongs to remain uncorrected because he trusted divine justice. He understood that God's timing carries authority human timing lacks. Waiting is not weakness. Waiting is alignment. When silence becomes strength, patience ceases to feel like endurance and begins to feel like wisdom. You start to see beyond immediate outcomes. You recognize patterns. You discern motives. You understand that many conflicts are not about truth, but about control. Silence refuses to participate in unnecessary conflict. It starves ego-driven battles. It deprives chaos of fuel.
But once the dependency breaks, something remarkable happens. Stability emerges. You begin to experience a quiet confidence that does not fluctuate with circumstances. You stop needing to be understood by everyone. You stop interpreting disagreement as threat. You stop defending yourself reflexively. This is not apathy. It is maturity. Jesus never chased understanding. He offered truth and allowed response to unfold naturally. He did not tailor his message to preserve comfort. He trusted the Father with the outcome. Silence teaches you to do the same. When identity is no longer reaction-based, you gain freedom. You can be present without performing. You can speak without forcing agreement. You can remain calm while others escalate. Silence stabilizes the self. This stability allows discernment to sharpen. You begin to sense when speech is necessary and when it would dilute clarity. You learn that not all truth needs to be verbalized immediately. Jesus understood this deeply. He withheld information not out of secrecy, but out of wisdom. He knew that revelation requires readiness. Timing matters as much as content. Silence respects timing. In your process, silence is training you to trust unfolding rather than forcing resolution. You learn to sit with ambiguity without panic. You tolerate unanswered questions without rushing to closure. This tolerance is essential for spiritual depth. Many people abandon faith not because they lack belief, but because they cannot tolerate uncertainty. Silence expands your capacity to trust without full visibility. Jesus trusted beyond visibility. He trusted in the Father's plan even when outcomes were unclear. He trusted through misunderstanding, delay, and apparent failure. Silence sustained that trust. When silence reshapes identity, you stop equating motion with progress. You recognize that stillness can be productive, that waiting can be active. This shift redefines success. Success becomes alignment rather than outcome, faithfulness rather than visibility, obedience rather than applause. Jesus modeled this redefinition constantly. He chose alignment over acceptance. He prioritized obedience over popularity. He withdrew when visibility threatened intimacy with the Father. Silence protected intimacy. In your life, silence is creating space for intimacy to deepen. Without noise, prayer changes. It becomes less performative and more relational, less about speaking and more about listening. Silence turns prayer into communion. You begin to notice God's presence not through dramatic signs, but through subtle awareness. Guidance becomes quieter but clearer. Conviction replaces compulsion. This is how the Spirit speaks to those who listen. Silence sharpens spiritual perception. When external noise decreases, internal discernment increases. You become more attuned to subtle shifts, promptings, cautions, confirmations. Jesus operated from this attunement. He moved when the Spirit indicated, not when pressure mounted. He waited when others demanded action. This attunement requires restraint. Silence also exposes internal resistance. In quiet moments, unresolved fears surface, old wounds resurface, insecurities demand attention. Silence does not distract from these, it confronts them. This confrontation is healing. God uses silence to bring buried issues into awareness so they can be healed properly. Noise numbs pain. Silence processes it. Jesus did not avoid pain, he faced it directly. In silence, he acknowledged anguish without allowing it to dictate disobedience. This is strength. Silence teaches emotional honesty without emotional control. You learn to feel without being governed by feeling. You acknowledge fear without submitting to it. This emotional regulation is critical for leadership, influence, and spiritual authority. Jesus' emotional awareness was profound, yet his actions remained aligned. He wept, yet he obeyed. He felt distress, yet he trusted. Silence allowed this integration. When silence reshapes identity, you stop reacting from wounded places. You respond from healed ones. This changes relationships dramatically. You stop defending old narratives. You stop projecting unresolved pain. You stop engaging in cycles that drain rather than build. Silence interrupts these cycles. It gives you space to choose differently. Jesus consistently chose differently. When insulted, he did not retaliate. When misunderstood, he did not force clarity. When betrayed, he did not seek revenge. These choices were possible because his identity was settled. Silence settles identity. As this settlement deepens, you begin to experience internal coherence. Thoughts align with values, actions align with conviction. There is less internal conflict. This coherence produces peace. Peace is not the absence of challenge, it is the presence of alignment. Silence cultivates this alignment by reducing internal noise. When internal noise quiets, purpose becomes clearer. Jesus moved with purpose because his inner world was ordered. He did not waste energy managing reactions. He invested energy in obedience. Silence conserved his strength. In your journey, silence is conserving yours. You may feel less expressive, less reactive, less externally engaged, but internally, capacity is increasing. Strength is accumulating. This is preparation. Silence is not removing your identity, it is refining it. You are being shaped into someone who doesn't need constant validation to remain steady, someone who doesn't collapse under misunderstanding, someone who trusts process over perception. This is spiritual adulthood. It is quiet, grounded, unshakable. And once identity is reshaped this way, silence is no longer something you fear. It becomes something you choose, because you know its value, because you have experienced its power, and because you understand that what is forged in silence cannot be undone by noise.